Hi, welcome to my Vision X talk about my favorite brushes. I'm really happy to be a part of this. So for my segment, I'm going to try and fit in a lot of information in 45 minutes. So I'm not going to do a full demo, but what I am going to talk about is brush choice and why I'm choosing certain brushes, and I'll demonstrate a little bit. I did want to mention Rosemary & Co. brushes because those are the brushes that I use every day, the ones that I recommend for all my workshops, for all my students. And I wanted to just show you guys this little thing because Rosemary was so smart, Rosemary and Simi, to create these like brush selections. So artists, who teach a lot can choose a package so that, these are the ones that I chose. Now, these aren't all the brushes that I use, but when you're trying to, I know a lot of times it's hard to spend a lot of money at one time, especially when you're taking a class. So I wanted to kind of do a bunch that I thought I just could not live without. And you can maybe see that the handles are shorter. They sell long handle brushes and they sell short handle brushes. Honestly, I prefer the short handle. Because when Scott and I travel a lot, we actually have in the past chopped our brushes off. And I bet you I can find one where we have chopped them off to fit in our pochade boxes, which is a travel case so that when you travel and paint, you can fit your brushes in there. So this is my bunch. Oopsie. This is my bunch. And I thought these were the brushes that if you were going to start trying to do simple portraits, these are a great starting point. Okay, so you'll see two Bristle fan brushes, and these are series 2055. I kind of consider these all around my all-purpose scumble, bristle, block in. Anytime I need to do something where I need to push a lot of paint around and I don't want it to get too opaque. And I'll talk about these and I'll show you some close-ups. Other brushes that I absolutely love that are in my brush bundle are these Eclipse Long Comber. I'll talk about why I like these, but these are great also for blocking in big areas with thin paint. I also have Eclipse Short Flats. These are great. You see how there's like a little bit of sizing, so you kind of break them in when you first get them. These are great for carving and painting. So when I do a lot of demonstrations and I do videos, I talk a lot about painting and drawing at the same time. Now this whole video is a little bit about a beginner's guide to if you want to start doing portraits. Because a lot of times when I teach in person, I will give a brush supply list, and then what happens is, and that's why I try and keep my brush bundle kind of small, but people already have brushes and they don't want to buy a bunch of new ones, and so very few people actually come with the brushes that I recommend. And so they struggle and they don't understand that, well, I want to get the same effects that you get, but why can't I do it with the brushes that I'm using? And a lot of times when I look at their brushes, I see that they have an array of rounds and filberts and like chunky bristle brushes. And those might be good for landscapes or even like some kind of still lifes. But when you want to start doing portraits and you are interested in getting more sensitive transitions or edges, you do have to invest into a few brushes that are going to allow you to get those effects. Now, my husband and I both do portraits. We paint differently. He doesn't necessarily use these brushes, but he does use them sometimes. So some people might say, well, I really want to paint thick. It doesn't matter. You can still paint thick with these brushes, and I'll talk to you a little bit how you do that. But the combers, the comber longs, the comber flats, I love all their sables. So this is like a pure sable round for doing detail. And then carving and painting at the same time is series 77 Sable. So I also recommend getting flats with long hair. So this would be like, okay, this would be like a long hair, and this would be a short hair. So you can, this is what I mean. Sometimes people will call this a bright, or they might just call it short. And this is a long hair, which means that you have more bounce. It's a bouncy, you can like touch the tip of it and you can push down and there's a bounce to it, where the short hairs are more stiff. And they both have different effects. And why do we choose them and why you need both? So trying to get a ton of information in 45 minutes. So I'm gonna focus on blocking in a profile with very simple value, but why I'm choosing different brushes for different things. One brush that I don't have in my bundle, because I was kind of trying to remind you that I wanted to keep them as low priced as possible, is an angled brush. So, geez. So one brush that I don't have in my bundle, but actually I have started to use a lot and has become almost a go-to where I can't live without. So this is also a brushes that I recommend for all my workshops, are these angles. And these are different. So this is an Ivory Dagger. This is a, this is a special one. I want to say the Tracy, or I will definitely get you this special. It's like a bristle. It's like almost slightly like a hog hair. And then this is an evergreen angle. So these are 3 different types of hair, bristle, and they are a little bit different. And I also have angled sables. So why would you even try an angled brush? Because it's that idea of carving and painting at the same time. But also, the cool thing about having angled brushes, especially some of these brushes like the Bristle or these Ivory, is because you can scumble so much. You can push and maneuver around and they hold up because they're a little bit stiffer than, say, a blended or a Sable. And then, so they're multi-use. You can push, you can scumble, I'll show you a little bit. And then because of this angle and this tip, you can go in there with delicacy. So you can push really hard, and then at the very end you can use that tip to kind of lay in paint. And a lot of times when I'm teaching, I talk a lot about how much actual bristle is on the brush. So let me grab one. Well, here, let me use this. Okay, so this is a short flat series 274, and this is a mix. You know, this, so this is a mixture of different hairs. But, and I'll show you a close-up. You see how much more hair is in this brush. And a lot of times, the rounder, the thicker, the chunkier the brush, you know, the more it holds more paint. So that's good for when you're scumbling, or it's good for when you want to paint thick, but you also have to know how to handle it. And I tell people that it's baby steps. You want to know exactly what your brush is doing. You want to be confident so that when you pick up your brush, or say you are going to go paint with friends, or paint a landscape, or go paint a model with friends, you can't take all your brushes. You have to choose and maybe take 10 to 15. Well, you have to know why you're taking those and take multi-purpose brushes. And so for me, brushes that are thinner are, for me, easier to handle, to manipulate, to understand, to know how much paint is on here. Because when you have a brush that is thicker down here at the shaft, it holds more paint, it's harder to be more subtle with, but we'll kind of go over that and I'll tell you why. All right, so I want you just to see, this is how I kind of lay out my paint on my palette, but I also lay out my brushes. I have so many more brushes than this, but I've also kind of tried to, just for you guys, show a little bit about some of the flats and brights. These are my bundle. These are the brushes that I'm probably going to be mainly using today. So every time I paint, the goal isn't to not use 100 brushes, because then you have to wash 100 brushes. The goal is to get a variety, so you have some big scumbling brushes, you have some more subtle, you have Sable, you have synthetic, you have round, you have flat, and you have long hair, you have short hair. So it's to get a variety, but to also limit yourself. So what we are going to do today is what I started was a portrait. So let's go over here and look at this. So this is a 12 by 12 inch polyurethane, water-based polyurethane museum board. So this is acid-free, and I love to use this for sketches for studies. And you can see, because I'm using white tape up here, you can see that it kind of has just the lightest bit of a gray neutral tint. Okay, and also on my monitor, I have 3 different photos. This is what I do all the time. I have a color version, I have a black and white, and I have a posterized. The posterized is my teaching tool that I just kind of go back and I remind myself, am I solidifying my shadows? Am I solidifying my lights? The main photo I work from is my black and white because I pre-select my brushes. I pre-select the paint I'm going to use. My palette over here, what I've done is I have 2 16 by 20 white kind of glass panels, and I lay them back, side by side. So this way I have a larger area to mix. The paint that I used for this portrait is Rembrandt Cool Gray, Viridian, Quinacridone Rose, Transparent Oxide Brown, and I think I maybe used the teensiest bit of Yellow Ochre Light, and then Titanium White. In general, I use very little yellow in this. I might have used it as a tad, but just warming things up with the Transparent Oxide Brown and the pink, those can go warm enough. I just wanted to let you guys know just the colors I'm using. So I limit my colors, I limit my values. I have a very strong light and dark photograph, so it helps me talk about brushes. I can't go into everything, but what I can do is I can talk about some big things I'm thinking about while I'm blocking this in. Okay, so I started this 2 days ago because I knew that I wanted to test it out first so that I would have an idea of like, okay, what do I want to tell people? Well, how I would start this drawing, because I will draw it out with oil, is I decided to start out drawing this painting with this Sable Series 91. And this is a size 6. This to me is a perfect size brush because it goes at a tip. So it's pretty thin also. So it's, I can use line. I can push down if I want. These sables, the way Rosemary makes her sables are so excellent. They are so multi-purpose. You can use them for acrylic, watercolor, oil paint. They're not delicate. That's probably what I want to try and emphasize, is the fact that you think you order, and they have like 4 or 5 different kinds of sables, so we're pretty lucky in that. When I first started to paint, you just didn't have this kind of variety of brush, this high quality. There was like maybe one brush company and everybody wanted those, and then they went out of business and you didn't know what to do and you were searching for good brushes. Now we don't have to worry about that. This is like the golden age of brushes. So we are all extremely lucky to have Rosemary and Company. And they're reasonable. I have no problem with promoting this company because of the fact that they are pretty much all I use, and I don't know what I would do without them. I really don't. Okay. So what I do just to draw this out is something else I want to emphasize when it comes to brushes. You must practice with different kinds of brushes. So what I did recently was I ordered some flats and some angled brushes in multiple different kinds of variety. The different hairs, the different sables, the different ivories, the different bristles, because they're going to act differently. And this right here is somewhat slick because it is a smooth museum board and I polyurethaned it 3 times. It has a smooth texture. Now, even if you use a canvas like Clausen's portrait, every brush is going to look a little bit different. And so you want to know the bounce, the give, the stiffness, and what it does to your paint. What I suggest you do, and what I always tell people, especially when they're first starting out with portrait, try working with your oil paint without any medium and with as little mineral spirits as possible. I use Gamsol. I really only dip my brush in the Gamsol if I need to fill in a big area, and I try not to. I mean, it's like I am dipping a toe in my Gamsol, because what happens is when you start to thin the paint out too much, either with medium or with Gamsol, it's very difficult to then know exactly what your brush is doing because the paint is too slippery. And so you start to get to know what does paint do in a more drier state. So, okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this Sable brush and I'm going to just, I want you to see how very little, I'm not even using any Gamsol at all. You see, and the good thing about some of these paints, the more transparent the paint, you know, transparent oxide brown, it is easier to manipulate. It doesn't have a lot of filler. So you see how I can dry brush around. It allows me to paint and draw, and I'm not adding any white to it. I'm not adding any, you know, solvent or medium. So it to me, what I call this is, I call this sort of dry scumble. Richard Schmid is very famous for doing this, and you know, it's a great way to learn how to do portraits or learn how to draw in anything. If you wanted to like draw in a still life, draw in a landscape, is to use a brush like this that has this sort of point and has a softness to it. Because if I was to use, say, a really chunky bristle, it would look scratchy. Not that that's bad, but if I really want to be able to make a line, you know, I want to draw, you see, and I make the calligraphy of this line, a bristle brush won't allow me to do that. So this Sable Series 91 is really wonderful. Okay, I'm going to do this pretty fast and loose. When I first blocked this in, I was a little bit more, where's the top of her head, where is the bottom of her chin, where is the front of her face, and where's the back of her head. Because this is a square, I wanted to make sure that her face wasn't directly in the center so that, you know, I could see all of her hair shape. Because a lot of times when you're doing profiles, to be all honest, that's the fun part. That is the fun part of profile, is to see the whole shape of the head. Okay, so I'm just going to, I want you to see how I hold my brush too. This is just, you know, I don't hold my brush like I'm writing a check. I hold my brush like this so that I can carve. So I'm just going to gesture. This drawing probably won't be as good as my one yesterday. So you see how I'm using the side and I'm just touching. It's like I'm using it like a pastel. So this is how I would block in a portrait. And I want you to see how light I'm touching it. And that just like I'm going back and forth, and I'm not pressing down. The whole idea is not to press down. So I see where that angle of the eyebrow is and where her eye is. And then I go straight down, do that plumb line. I talk about drawing and blocking things in a little bit more on different videos. This is all about why I chose this brush. And I chose this brush because of the point, because of the fact that it's a Sable that when I go back and forth and you see how light, it kind of creates a ghostness. And I don't put a ton of paint down, and there's no medium, so I'm not fighting it. If I needed to clean up my drawing, you see how just a paper towel does that? So the idea to help you out is less paint in the beginning, thinking about only the shadows. So, you know, you kind of squint and you figure out where the shape of the nose is, you know, where the shape of the mouth is, the upper lip, the bottom lip, and the chin. And then all of this. And then this is a great brush for doing these angles, you know, these angles. Figuring out where her hair is, figuring out where the back of the head is. But I wouldn't block in the painting, the whole painting with this brush. You know, these are for small little areas. I'm also a great proponent of choosing the right size brush for the shape. This is perfect for when you're blocking in these just small little shapes and you need to be angular. So that's why you want something that kind of goes to a point and you can use an edge. Now, like let's say I wanted to block in more of the side of here. This brush, the Angular Series 275, is just a great overall brush. It's a mixed hair. I think it's called Master's Choice. I'm just going to go by what's on the brush side, which is number 275. And it's at an angle. So you see how I can carve? These angular brushes allow me to paint and draw at the same time. So this is a great overall brush for doing this kind of shape. So let me grab some paint, and I'm doing the exact same thing where I'm not picking up any sort of mineral spirits or any sort of stuff. And so you see also I'm holding it very lightly because I want to be able to scumble. You see how just moving the brush back and forth, and if I have to fix my drawing, I can fix my drawing. I'm not putting too much paint down. If I was to use a brush that had a lot of hair or was around or something, it would create much more of a scratchy look. So this is sort of in between. It's not a sable. It has a little bit more body. It's just maybe a tad bit more have more body than a sable. But you see how I can, especially if I put the tiniest bit of paint down and I maneuver it and I kind of create this ghost shape, it's still transparent enough that no matter what, I can go in with my paper towel and not even with mineral spirits, but you see how I can clean up? So the whole idea is to always be in control of how much paint you put on the canvas and never get ahead of yourself. Just because you see other people painting so thick and juicy, they have done it 100,000 times and you get used to it and you've made a zillion mistakes and you know what not to do. Now, this is a Evergreen Angle. So I'm choosing this brush because this is a little bit bigger, and this will allow me to kind of, you see how pushing down, it allows me to push the paint. I can still be kind of gentle and just touch at the edge, like feathering it, but if I push down, you see how much it like moves the paint around. But it also has a softness. Because it's a synthetic, it won't have that scratchy look. You can kind of, you can really, really work these evergreens pretty hard. All right, so what is the difference between an evergreen and, let's say, a fan brush, which is kind of, I love. I'm going to show you why I love a fan brush. Number one, fan brushes are very, very thin. Look at, it's really almost like one layer of bristle. So that tells me that I'm not going to have lots of like stored paint down in the shaft, and I can manipulate it. I can actually paint just using this tip. So if I needed to do some like delicate like highlights, I could just put things, or you see I could even like, put like a little rim or an edge. But also the good thing about a fan brush is I put it down and you see how I can move it out. And it gives you a very dancey stroke. So you could, if you want, just kind of do this, kind of go up and down and be very kind of methodical by just going back and forth. And now, if you look closely, you'll see that there's a scratchiness to that, which is a lot of times what I love when I'm blocking in a big area of dark. Because what happens is sometimes when we are trying to figure out the value of something, we maybe don't go as dark as we should. So you see how if I just kind of go and I'm filling in her hair, right? I really have very little paint, and I can kind of fill in her hair, and I would do this for the background. I have no mineral spirits and no medium. It's just the paint being manipulated around. But the reason why I like this is because it's so airy. And that's probably, you might have heard that before. Keeping your shadows thin and then making your highlights a little bit thicker, a little bit more opaque. And if you're using let me go back to this. So if you're using your synthetic, remember the synthetic kind of smooths it out a little bit more. So that is the difference between like a synthetic and a bristle. Sometimes I love using these together. If, let's say, I put way too much paint on and I make part of this hair like way too, what happens is a lot of times people put so much paint on their brush, right? And they just kind of fill it in and they kind of smooth it, and so everything becomes very, very solid. Well, there are some different ways of let's say, going back in and giving some nuance. But a great way is to go in with a fan brush and you can just sort of scrape. So you're sort of like picking up paint without changing the value and without changing the drawing. So that is one thing that I hope you guys take away from. We all do it. Sometimes we all put too much paint down in one area. Either the paint itself is got too, itself, it just has a lot of filler and it's not very transparent, or we get too thick. And we want to clean it up. Well, just use a fan brush. So this is what I do a lot. And then what you can also do is go back with your synthetic and say just here and there to like soften it edge. You can kind of just drag it over very gently. Because also what we need to be careful of is when we're painting, like say when I was blocking this in, say certain brush strokes are going sideways and there's getting a lot of glare. What you do then is you can go back in, with these great brushes. This is an Eclipse Comber, and it's a very delicate brush. It's thin, it's relatively bouncy and long, and if I just skirt the canvas, you see how I just kind of drag it. This is a great brush to cut down some of the glare. Sables are a great brush, like say I was painting the skin tone right up to the hair and I really needed just to have that small edge. Instead of grabbing a brush that is just a little too aggressive, you take this Sable and you just kind of gently, and this is where you start to learn about touch, is that you just take what's there and you just blend it together. And instead of using a bristle, you use a Sable, which has just this gentle little kiss. You can manipulate these edges along something without disappearing or picking up. So now I'm going to talk about, these are both Series 275. This is a 1/2 inch and this is a 1/4 inch, and these are angled. Now these are great brushes when I am carving in a profile to apply the paint, put it on an angle, and then push in. And I love having different sizes because the small one is perfect for like going in here or going up against the nose or inside here, or when you don't want this big, you want to put something down flat and carve, but that's why it's good to have different sizes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, I'd mix some of this just sort of basic flesh color, and so I'm just going to kind of like show you how you can scumble and you fill in. I don't think I have like any mineral spirits on this. If I did, it's like a tad. But you see this particular brush smooths things out. So it's almost like it's creating a very thin, almost like, I guess I could call it like a stain. You could have like a little bit of a dry brush, but if you just go over it again, you see how I keep saying it's like I'm using a pastel. So I'm staining the canvas very, very thin, because if I want to put highlights or halftones or juicier strokes, I put them on top of that. It's difficult when you start to paint too thick too soon. So you start to think about, now this is a great brush for just blocking in this skin tone, right? See how I'm kind of going back and forth, and I'm manipulating a little bit of paint and having it go, you know, it's like a little bit of paint doing a lot of distance. Okay, now what else I can do is, because that is painted so thin, what I will do now is I will take a brush that is crisp, short, sturdy, and these are great brushes to go up to something. You see how I'm just sort of, I don't even have the drawing here, but I'm just kind of going up to that nose. See how I kind of create this edge and then I push out. So this is how a lot of times, you know, I get my profiles, right? I get this shorter hair brush. It won't be as easy. First of all, you couldn't do it with a fan brush. It'd be much more difficult to do it with a brush like this, even though it's flat. See how bouncy it is? The more, you know, I mean, you could do it a little bit, but why not take a brush that makes things a little bit easier? So you get to an edge and you push out, and then you carve, and then you carve. So you're using these big angles to like carve, and you see how I can kind of manipulate the paint. It's still thin. So this is what I'm saying about like using carved angles. And if I would use like a little smaller one to get in here, and a little smaller one to get into the lips. So that's why you need different size. Now, I remember on this painting that I painted before that I'm using a little bit of Gamsol with some Viridian and some cool gray. So I remember when I started to block this in, you know, I was doing this. You see how I'm kind of use one stroke and then it's almost like I manipulate it so it moves a lot. But it looks pretty thin. Now, what if I was to use a bigger, or let me try using this brush. I'm going to show you what it looks like to use this brush. So now I'm using the Eclipse Comber, which is more of a finesse brush because it has a longer hair. It's flat. You see how it's like it drags a little bit easier. So you start to get used to realizing, oh, okay, the Evergreen brush is a sturdy brush. You can really scumble it and move it around. But then, like, say, I really want to see some of these strokes. You know, I want to see some of these. And it depends on how much you press. So if you press down really hard, you can get a super strong dark, right? If I press down and I kind of lift up, it's a little bit more opaque. It's a little bit more solid, you see? But like say, I don't press down so hard and I use just a lick of mineral spirits, then you see how I can get these long strokes and you can get some of these streaks. And you can even do that thing where you kind of, like with my fan brush, you can kind of start and you push in. And you know, you can kind of scumble and you could create variety. But the reason why I love these kind of flats is because when you are doing backgrounds, you don't want the background to look so solid that it almost looks opaque, it looks heavy. That's what, I mean, that's the word I'm going for, heavy. You want it to have a little bit of air, even if the whole background is going to be relatively green, right? You want to have a little bit of lighter green, darker green. You want to have, you know, strokes going sideways, strokes going vertically. So these type of brushes are really good. Let me show you what would happen with a fan brush. So I'm getting, it allows me to get a lot more paint. And this is that series 2055. So look at how much wider this is. So look, see how I could fill in so much better, and it creates a little bit more drama. Now, you could do this like what we did with here. If for some reason I got way too thick, or if you want to create like a really exciting background, like say, you know, you like want to use palette knife too. So I'm taking some palette knife, taking some of this red and some of this cool gray, and say we do this. right? It's kind of more exciting, right? You have up and down strokes, side strokes. So even within the palette knife, you have thick and thin. But you want to play around a little bit. You just go in here, you see how I very lightly can kind of manipulate. I can kind of go back and forth. I can drag some of these colors into each other. And a lot of it is the touch, because I can push down. The harder I push, the more it picks up. But if I just drag it really gently, I can manipulate it a little bit, and I can be a little bit more playful in some of these backgrounds. So you see how you kind of vertical, horizontal, but just don't have too much of the same thing. Like then you can kind of, but it's all about a light touch. And that's why I love these big fan brushes, because I can really get big sweeping strokes, right? And these are the kind of strokes that you really want when you're doing big things of hair or you're doing big things of backgrounds, because there's nothing more boring to me than having lots and lots of little strokes. I mean, unless it's so in the design, like a Klimt or something, or an Edgar Payne. But if it's not thought out, it can look monotonous. And it's good to have big and small, thick and thin. Okay, what I wanted to show you was how, especially when you're going to be doing like maybe highlights or like more accent strokes, like pretty strokes on top of the skin, you pre-mix. Because I'm going to use this brush. Now this is a Sable, pure Sable 7320. And this is funny, this showed you this is one of the brushes that I actually cut in half because I wanted to fit it in something. I want you to see though how long it is. It's much more floppy. So this will be a little bit better. Like I would use this brush over this brush. This is the brush that I would put in for when I want to like manipulate or carve and draw. Once I start putting highlights, I wouldn't use this brush because of the fact that it is so stiff. You see how it's stiff, and it's sort of like a bright, it's a short, so it's a little bit, doesn't have as much bounce. When you use a brush that is bouncier, so let me just I'm just gonna like take this, you see how now I just am able to take paint at the very tip of my brush. So the paint doesn't go all the way to the shaft. And now this is what I'm going to put as my highlight. And I even like doing it like this a little bit. We see how you kind of flail it out a little bit, so that when I put it on, let's do a stroke where I show you where I put it on. Okay, so I know that I'm going to use this stroke as maybe the highest highlight on her nose right here. And I know I'm going to have to use a very gentle pressure because the whole skin tone underneath is solid. I don't want to change. I don't want to pick up. So what happens is a lot of times when people are painting alla prima, which means wet into wet, they will use a stiff brush to paint highlights on top of wet paint, which will mean that it will pick it up, or even those brights. So if you're painting with those bristles and I try and put a stroke down, it's going to obliterate what's underneath it. I don't want to get rid of what's underneath it. I want to see these bigger strokes, and then you place this stroke on top of it. So I try and go in here, and let's just see if I can try and do it in one stroke. You see how I kind of go here, and I just put it down. I'm really gentle, and I just do that. And I also like the fact, if you can get a real close-up, that because I had such a gentle touch, it's not completely smoothed out. And you see how I kind of like did it gently and I did it sideways. I didn't do this. I did it more like sideways, just a smaller little stroke. So thinking about doing something that is long, which will create a more solid, or thinking about little tiny little dabs. So you see how I have a little green, a little pink, a little violet. All right, let me try a different stroke. And I'm going to try a different brush. These are the type of brushes that I would use a lot to place paint on top of already simple flat paint. This round series 272 is good for like doing stuff like right here at the lips maybe, or at the eyebrows or in the hair, because it's a round, but it's also very floppy and soft. And I would only use it to soften just at the very tip, or maybe have, you know, soften things into each other. These are some of my favorite brushes, the Eclipse Long Comber. So this is a brand new one, and this is one that I've used a little bit. So you see how this one's a little bit more pristine, and this is one that I've used, and I love both. So this one's a little bit more where, you know, maybe you'll have more of a crisper look, and this is one where you like to have it like a little bit more jaggedy. So I don't throw these out, and I don't try and create them to be pristine, because when I do it, I will see a little bit more variety. But let me do a stroke with the with one of these. Okay, so you see how this is just a little bit cleaner, and let me just go in here. Let me do it up here actually. So I'm going to go right here. See how I kind of go, and I go sideways. It's a very delicate touch, but I still see a little bit of variety, and that's what these long, floppy ones do. Let me show you what it would look like if I did that same value, but with this shorter bright, and if I did it right next to it. It's just a little bit more solid. Now, it's not like something that's horrible, but if you want to have a more delicate look and you want to see a little bit of variety, you would use those floppier type of bristles, those longer sables, those longer, you know, combers. So if I was to try and mix my value with this, what would happen? I would get so much paint in my brush, right? It would just get filled up with paint. But if I pre-mix, so I'm only using Viridian and the quinacridone rose for these highlights. I'm just kind of, you know, I'm not trying to be anything super fancy. I'm just going back and forth between some cools, some warms, some violets, and the Viridian and the quinacridone rose makes some beautiful violets. Okay, so I need to pre-mix this. And I've only really learned this from trial and error, because, you know, if I was to go in and just try and dig and mix, I would get too much paint. And remember what I talked about in the beginning is that I want to be able to really know and handle what the amount of paint is in my brush. And I'm using the brush, you see I'm using the brush that has been used a lot. So you see how it is kind of splayed? I love that. Both Scott and I love splayed brushes. We don't want all of our brushes to be 100% pristine. So I have this pre-mixture. You see how I just used the tip of it? Okay. Okay, so you see how it's splayed out a little bit? And I'm going to make this stroke a little bit bigger, so I'm going to kind of like do it at an angle. And even this little bit down here. So these are great brushes. I think they're perfect for doing hair, for doing bigger shapes, because her cheekbone isn't as strong and as sharp as her nose or her forehead. So I can like use a bigger brush to create that turning. But also brushes like this are great for, let me do a highlight just on the very tip of her scarf in her hair, because I don't want, so I just add a little bit more pink, right? So if I want to do like a little pink accent, you see how I just drag it right there? I don't want it to be solid. I'm literally just using the tips and I'm pulling it away. And so these are the type of strokes that make your paintings look colorful. And if you do a little bit too much, all I do is I might like take it away a little bit with a paper towel. You can smooth it out with a palette knife, all that stuff. But it's allowing yourself to use brushes that smooth paint out and solidify it. You can use these longer hairs to use an irregular stroke, which is all about variety. I love having smooth and I love having irregular. Okay, so now what I do is I have the shadow side of my hair, I have the lighter side of my hair, and I was using some of these bristle brushes to create texture so that everything wasn't like super smoothed out, but like say right on top of that, say I just wanted to drag a little bit. You see how I'm just kind of touching? So you can kind of like just touch. And these are the strokes that you put down and you don't want to smooth out. Like just where the light hits, you know, certain areas of the hair. So that's how you would create texture, is that you fill in with a bigger brush and a sturdier brush, and then these kind of floppy hair, can you just do a little bit of irregular strokes? And I also, the very last thing I want to show you is why I love these Ivory Daggers, because these are great for scumbling in big areas. You see the angle, and they are an ivory dagger, so they're a synthetic. But because of the tip is perfect. You see how I only paint on the tip too? The tip is perfect because this brush is multi. You can use it as a flat, big scumbling, or once you go to the tip, it turns into like a round. So like if I just wanted to have a few curls, see just a few curls here and there. So that's why I love using this, because it both is, it's multi. You can do a little detail with the tip, or you can do a carve, and you can do a big giant like wash-in with like, it's almost like a scumble. So those are the main things I wanted to get through to you, was variety in hair, variety in size, big and small, and also to understand, to be able to use the right amount of paint on your brush so that you're not like always being frustrated, like why can't I get those effects? And using as little amount of mineral spirits and medium, that's also going to allow you to understand what paint will do, and to use as little of paint as possible until you have it where, like I could go really thick in the hair right now. I could go really thick in the background because I have my values and my shapes set. You saw how I played with the palette knife in those other strokes. So that is something to think about, is get correct stuff first, then play with getting thicker as you become more comfortable. One thing I want to show you guys, you see how I have this white paint, this tape. White tape is really good for when you're taking photographs of your artwork. Because when I first started out on this canvas, it was so contrasty, right? I'm putting down a few of the darks, blah, blah, blah. It was so contrasty. But if I can always use a white balance in my Photoshop, every single photo as I take it in progress, I can adjust it and make it the same. So that's just something to think about for all you guys. If you want to put a sheet of paper, like a typing paper, or getting artist white tape, it's really just a great thing to do for taking photographs of your work. I hope you've learned a lot, and I know I had to punch a lot into 45 minutes, and greatest lesson is experiment with your brushes and try lots of different hairs. See what they do for you.
Good job.